Hi, welcome to a lesson of Jesus in Exodus, where we're going to be studying the book of Exodus, seeing how we can find Christ in it. And today we're just going to be looking at some of the historical background of the book of Exodus, looking at some of the important figures and themes, plus authorship and date, and also some of the geography. So, to begin, the book of Exodus is one of the 5 books of the Pentateuch. So the complete list being Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, although most scholars agree that Moses was the author of the Pentateuch, there are many other schools of thought about this, many of which believe that Moses actually took very little part in writing the Pentateuch, or even no part. And that these first 5 books of the Bible are really the result of several authors writing over a very long period of time. Now, why is there a debate? First of all, the Pentateuch is not really associated with an author. It's essentially anonymous. So, if it's anonymous, why do we believe that Moses wrote it? Well, let's look at Exodus chapter 24. And it says, "Then he said to Moses, 'Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. Moses alone shall come near to the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him.' Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules. And all the people answered with one voice and said, 'All the words that the Lord has spoken we will do.' And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars, according to the 12 tribes of Israel." Now that's Exodus 24, 1 through 4. So here we see that God gives Moses the law, and Moses writes it down. So there is very good reason to believe that since he wrote down the law sometime after the Exodus from Egypt, that Moses was the one who wrote the 5 books of the Pentateuch. However, since there is nothing that states that he did specifically, we aren't entirely sure. Now, are there other clues in Scripture that might tell us who the author is? Absolutely. We can look at other books in the Old Testament, yes, we can look at other books in the Old Testament, but we can also look at the words of Jesus himself. For example, in John chapter 5, Jesus is defending his God-given authority to speak. And after receiving some opposition, he actually cites Moses' authorship. So this is from John chapter 5, and it says, "How can you believe when you receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes only from God? Do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, on whom you have set your hope. For if you believed Moses, you would have believed me. For he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words?" Jesus' words here in John 5, 44 through 47 references Moses as the one who wrote about him. So we know that in Jesus' time, Moses was still thought to have written a significant part of the Torah. Now here are some other New Testament references of Moses' authorship. We have Mark 7:10, which says, "For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother. Whoever reviles father or mother must surely die.'" So we see Moses being referred to, again, also in Mark 12:26, which says, "And as for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses," okay, so the book of Moses associated with Moses, "in the passage about the bush, how God spoke to him, saying, 'I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob.'" Then we have Matthew 19:7, which says, "They said to him, 'Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?'" They're talking about divorce, and Jesus is discussing the law with them. But they are referencing the law and the law that Moses received from God and wrote down. So we see in Jesus' time, the understanding was that Moses was given the law, and the law was given by God. Of course, as pointed out by Tremper Longman, who wrote this great book on the Old Testament, in his introduction on the Old Testament, there are some texts that Moses couldn't have written. Obviously, he couldn't have written the section about his death. And some scholars are actually more in favor of another theory, one that suggests that the Pentateuch, in which we find Exodus, was written over a long period of time, not by one author, but by several. And this brings us to something called the documentary hypothesis. So, the documentary hypothesis is an attempt to describe the authorship of the Torah, of the Pentateuch, and is founded on four guiding, authors. And so starting around the 18th century, it became increasingly popular to question the nature of God's involvement with humanity and the inspiration of Scripture, as well as its authorship. People were thinking of God more as a distant God who set the world turning, who wasn't necessarily intimately involved with it anymore. And so, although the documentary hypothesis describes the work of several scholars within this time period in the 18th century, one of the most well-known is Julius Wellhausen. Essentially, it was his view that the Torah was a compilation of four sources with four separate foci, listed as the J, the D, the E, and the P. And those are just abbreviations for these four different authors, or these four different sources that were compiled, as he theorized, over a period of about 4 centuries. And I'm going to go over what those abbreviations are. So, the J is the Auguste Source. The E would be the Elohist Source. Okay, so we've got the two prominent names of God being compared. And then the D would be the Deuteronomic Source, and then the P was the priestly source. So according to Wellhausen, each of these had a different focus. So the Auguste Source was tracing, he said, Israel's history from Genesis 2, verse 4, all the way to when Israel is about to enter Canaan. Now, while the Auguste Source was characterized by the dominant use of the name Yahweh for God, the Elohist Source, so that would be the E, focused on Elohim to describe God, which is really interesting. And somewhere along the line, they believe that those two sort of merged. And then you had the Deuteronomic Source, and he claimed that this was much more concerned with the blessings and the cursings, and was basically the whole book of Deuteronomy. And then lastly, we had the priestly source, which was hypothesized to have been written last, so around the post-exilic period, actually. And he believed that it added the beginning of Genesis, and then Exodus, Numbers, and all of Leviticus. So in his theory, Wellhausen argues that really it took 4 centuries for the Pentateuch to be combined, which is totally different from the, I would say, pretty prominent Christian view that it was Moses who compiled the Pentateuch. So while the documentary hypothesis does highlight the human elements of the Bible, because the Bible is human and it's divine, it may cause one to question the latter, right? Proponents of this hypothesis may doubt the divine nature of Scripture altogether, which is something we have to consider if the Bible is going to have any bearing on our lives at all. So whether or not Moses wrote the majority of the Pentateuch isn't really the most important question. The most important question that we should be asking when we're going through the book of Exodus is whether or not it's truly God's inspired word. Let's move on to date. So the book of Exodus covers about 85 years worth of material. So this is starting from Moses' birth to the 2nd year and the 1st month that the Israelites are in the wilderness from Egypt. So pinpointing a date has always been a struggle for scholars, but there are 2 main popular views, the early date and the late date, and scholars have really just tried to determine the date by examining the Egyptian pharaohs and the years that were in power. And since there are only a few that had reigns that were 40 years or longer, it's made it easier for them to narrow those down. So Those periods of rule are usually the center of discussion when trying to pinpoint a date on the book of Exodus. So for the early date, the pharaoh that would be over the oppression of Israel from 1504 to about 1450 BC would be Thutmose III. And then the pharaoh who was over the Exodus would be Amenephis II, ruling from 1450 to 1425. Now those who believe that it's a later date believe that there were different pharaohs. So over the oppression, that would be Ramses I from 1320 to 1318, so quite a bit later. And then over the Exodus would be Seti I between 1318 and 1304. Now, something to understand about the early and late date is it really has to do with whether or not the scholar interprets those years that are actually listed in Scripture literally or as symbolic years. So, for example, in Exodus 12:40, it states that Israel was in Egypt for 430 years. And so proponents of the early date would say, yes, we actually take those dates literally. Scholars also generally go by Judges 11:26 and then 1 Kings 6:1 just for context. Those are events that happen after the Exodus, but to help them kind of judge the date. So essentially, whether you're early date or late date really depends on whether or not you interpret those numbers as literally as possible or as symbolic. Now, we're going to talk about places. So Exodus is really the story of God redeeming his people from Egypt, establishing a covenant relationship with them and a culture of worship, and then eventually leading them toward the promised land. Now, in order to just get a better view of where these events took place, we're actually going to look at some of the geography of Egypt in the late Bronze Age when the Exodus actually took place. So if we can see this map, this is Egypt in the late 2nd millennium BC. Now, the book of Exodus opens with this overview of what's happened with the sons of Israel since Joseph. So if we remember the end of Genesis, Joseph is in Egypt, his family comes to Egypt, and then we find out in the beginning of Exodus that the Israelites have completely flourished. Now, as we know, the Israelites come under the oppression of the Egyptians, and the opening of Exodus tells us a little bit about that oppression of the Israelites, specifically that they constructed 2 store cities for Pharaoh called Pithom and Ramses. And what's really interesting is that we know that these were located in the land of Goshen. We see that in Exodus 1:11. In fact, Ramses, or Tel Ed Dabah, is actually near modern Contir, and it is right there. So, of course, the people didn't stay in Egypt. Moses comes to redeem the people from Pharaoh, and as we know the story, they cross the Red Sea, or actually what we know now is the Reed Sea, to begin their 40-year journey towards the Promised Land. Now, what's interesting is that scholars don't actually know the exact location of some of these really important sites, like Mount Sinai. They don't know the exact mountain, or Mount Horeb, or the exact place of the crossing of the Red Sea. This has kind of been a subject of debate with scholars for a very long time. However, Exodus 13:17-18 does give us some really good geographical context, explaining that God did not lead the Israelites near the Philistines, but instead took them into the wilderness toward the Red Sea. Now, apparently this route that they took was a well-known path frequently used by Pharaoh Thutmose III, and so if God had taken them on that path, it's possible that they would have encountered the Pharaoh's troops. Other hypotheses include the central Sinai route and then the traditional Sinai route, although there's no clear way of knowing. Now, the exact location of the Red Sea crossing, as I said, is unknown, but some scholars posit that what is translated as the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, the Yam Sut, is actually mentioned in Exodus 10:19 for the first time, and then several other times throughout the book, and some of the other books in the Pentateuch. It's actually separate from the Red Sea, which we see in this diagram. We're not really talking about the Gulf of Suez. It's possible that this was just a general term called the Sea of Reeds. So that's just some geography background. Like I said, we don't really know, but it is interesting to be able to look at the original language and kind of take a guess. From the time that Moses is born to the very end of the Exodus, when God is creating this culture of worship and really just drawing Israel to himself, the whole thing is a drama. And so it's really exciting to just get to look at some of the historical, linguistic, geographical nuances in the book of Exodus, and then try and find Christ in them. So thank you for joining me for this lesson. We'll see you next time.